terror among the black families that had ventured onto white turf had become thick and tangible, like illness, but they kept buying houses.
Yeah.
And my parents were born in the 30s and still alive. They're in Houston. And mom and dad both broke color barriers in education, in military, and in government. Dad was in Social Security Administration, mom teaching, and dad in government. And I remember asking my dad the question that my now 6-year-old granddaughters asked me: why do they hate us so much? Mm-hmm. And so my dad had me to begin to memorize scripture, to memorize the Constitution, to memorize poetry. Like, my white friends weren't having to do this. So I had a whole other education when I got home because I was told I had to be 2 or 3 times better than my colleagues in elementary and middle school, because I was in integrated schools at the time, in the 70s and 80s. And I realized that I didn't have the luxury of feeling safe. My parents helped me understand it wasn't going to be safe. I was going to have to do this scared.
Yeah.
I was going to have to do this brave. But it has been the conversation with my white members and congregations and my white friends that when they hear the stories and hear my struggle, it humanized both of us. And so what I hear you saying in that, it is like, literally, how do we humanize? We all ain't nothing but dirt. Mm-hmm. With the finite amount of time, with the ruach, the very breath of God in each of us. What are we gonna do with that space and time? And so the accommodation and your boldness is the kind of bravery we all need to hear and read the stories, because they are where truth is.
I'm not taking any points for courage. Mm-hmm. I was a journalist, a writer. Mm-hmm. I wanted to write a book. Mm-hmm. I wrote a book. I don't know how much courage that takes. I was so struck by the kind of courage you're talking about. After the book came out, I ran into a woman whose house had been bombed, and I wanted to hear the story. So I went to her house, which she still lived in. And she was old by then. It was bombed when she was young, in the late 50s, in old South Dallas. Mm-hmm. And her story was that the front end of the house was blown off. She and her husband were in bed. It was a new house. They just bought it. And the front end was blown off the house with dynamite. And her husband was injured. His leg was hurt, but she wasn't injured. So she staggers out to the front of the house, and there are firemen who've come into the house, and they've asked, was anybody hurt? It just happened. And I remember, I'm sorry, I left out an important element. I asked her if she had reported this to the police. What was the role of the police? So when she staggered out into the front of the house and all this smoke and din, the fire department was there and the cops were there in her house. And she looked at me and she said, what do you mean, did I report it to the police? The police were in on it. They were there when it happened. And when I told them that my husband was injured, they said, okay, we'll call the colored ambulance, which they did. So anyway, she told me this story, and as I drove off, I thought, wait a minute, she's still in that house. Somebody blew the front off her house, and the cops and the fire department were in on it, and she's still living in that house. What kind of courage does that take? To say, this is my house, I'm going to fix it, and I'm going to stay here, and we're going to pay off this mortgage.
Right.
That's remarkable.
The courage means with heart. And so while you don't have that kind of courage, the heart to write it and to come back and to say the why. Like, what is your why? And us each to ask, what's our why? To sit in this audience, to be online, to dig around into stuff that just didn't get talked about. I thought I was giving my daughter a better world. I thought I was giving my grandson a better world. I never imagined a Sandra Bland. Mm-hmm. I never imagined a George Floyd. Like, that's not in my imagination. I just thought we were so much better than that. So whether we're talking about Minneapolis or we're talking about Dallas, there is a place that takes a kind of bravery for each of us to say that enough is enough. And so for that woman to go back to that house, mm-hmm. for us to look squarely at January 6th mm-hmm. and that insurrection, and for us to say, not on my watch. I mean, that's the line that I believe that the church is going to have to draw now, that we have to create an enough and enough is enough line. Because another part from the book that I was like, as we're getting ready for the fair, I got to find my notes. We're getting ready for the fair, and I'm like, okay, there's integration now, no more segregation, except for like there's a colored day, and then there's like a KKK day. Like, what is that? Mm-hmm. And so it's a little bit triggering that this fair time is coming, and knowing how that was accommodating. And even when there was the colored day or the end day, there was no restaurants they could go to. Huh. Today, there are places that people can't go because of the economics, but there's also places they can't go because the transportation system. Mm. We think about South Dallas now, and the work that Northway Christian Church is doing with Greater Garth Community, AME, African Methodist Episcopalian Church, African Methodist, AME, is a garden, because what they have taught us, as we who are North Dallas Church, working to build bridges with the South Dallas Church, we know that that bridge has to come both ways. And they have exposed us to the fact that people who live in that community, because there are not good grocery stores there. It's an hour and a half to commute to one by different buses, an hour and a half back, so it's 3 hours just to commute to, but that's not even the grocery store time. Then you got to carry the groceries. That's not a food desert as we think, because in desert, things grow. That's a food apartheid. Structural systems built in this amazing city that has been not addressed. There's a role for the church to play in that. And so as I think about where do we go from here after we hear all of this information, to really start with poverty, to look at housing, to look at education, to look at our healthcare systems, so that we might move this accommodation, because I feel like we're moving to accommodation 2.0, but I want to keep my church and my job, so I'm not going to tell you why I said that. But it has to do with a certain shift that's happening now in our city. And if we're not careful, we'll be there again.
So both of you have talked about the challenges, the history, but I think you both alluded to hope. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. While recognizing that there's still these systems, and that's a word sometimes that I think people I've experienced get really lost in and struggle with. What do you mean systemic? Mm-hmm. What does that mean? So in the context of your work, your research, to what extent we've made progress, mm-hmm. but to what extent are you concerned about the systems that are in place and are building mm-hmm. to marginalize communities of color?
I've talked about the book on several occasions in tandem with Dallas County Commissioner John Wiley Price, who wrote the introduction. And often at the end of a meeting like that, somebody will ask me, do you think things are getting better? Or do you think things have gotten better? And so my little speech is about, yes, how amazingly better, how amazingly changed. The CEO of the Citizens Council isn't Alex Bickley anymore, it's Kelvin Walker. And I talk about all the things that seem remarkably better. The more I talk, the more I can see Commissioner Price. He does this thing where he starts having back trouble or something. And then he says, okay, I'm not going to argue with Brother Schutz's story here about how much better things are, but I just want to leave you with the fact that there is a United States Census tract in southern Dallas where a child born today will die 23 years sooner than a child born in Frisco. And he said, while you're patting yourselves on your back for how much better everything is, ask yourself how you can live with that. How can we live with this sort of slow-rolling holocaust of children? The kids didn't get to decide where they were going to be born. And so I try to hold both things in mind at the same time. I think it's a mistake to deny the progress we've made. And it's a mistake not to see how much farther along young people are than I am. But Commissioner Price is not wrong. We have things in our midst that are difficult even to contemplate.
Yeah, it is. What I hear in his response to you and what I feel in my body right now, it's the generational poverty. It's the generational lack of access to a thing. And so one generation might, but then a lot of them might move from Dallas. So it's like starting over. You've heard that, you've seen that scratch line, you've done that exercise. It's further to go. One of the pieces that you write, people have got to learn how to reach out and form coalitions around issues, Price says. That just doesn't happen yet in Dallas, and it has to happen. People have to learn how to identify areas of mutual interest and coalesce around them before we can move ahead and begin to solve a lot of the major problems before us. He's arguing for finding something around mutuality. I'm on a council group of clergy with the Dallas police chief. And one of the things that he told us, he gets here and he was like, whoa, this city is wonderfully awful. It's wonderful and it's awful. Both are true. Like we live in this paradox.
Yeah.
Not paradise. It's paradoxical. There are some amazing things here. Yes. And when he realized that the way our highways are laid out and the infrastructure, there were no theaters that were up and running within a circumference of a certain area. Well. The ones that were closed down. He said, where they do that? I can't say it in his Puerto Rican accent, but he's like, where do they do that? Like, you have children that leave here. You have teenagers. How do you not have movies, entertainment? This is in the pandemic, right? He's like, so now we've lost more movie theaters. Kids don't even have a safe place to go for 2 hours. So what do? They go to car washes that are by liquor stores that are near drug dealers. That's systematic. Like, who thought that out? Well, my friends, whether they were black or white, my friends in Frisco, my friends in Allen, they're like, we chilling, we hanging out, we're having a great time. Their children are fine.
Yep, all right.
Right? Mm-hmm. So that's what he's saying. I mean, that's the real life story. Like, so part of the solution to not stay in the problem side of it, the police chief said, I got to find some people who will help me set up a movie theater. Mm-hmm. And so someone said, hey, I'll buy the screen, I'll buy that. They didn't know it was going to be $100,000. But people begin to coalesce around, let's get the children from the closed down car washes near the liquor stores, and let's at least get them to a safe place of entertainment, because they're already left home alone. They already are malnutrition because they're not getting that kind of food in the summer. They're already suffering, as we all did during the pandemic. And so I think as we hear these stories, to believe them and to find a way forward where we can both hold the positive movement of our progress forward, but to not ignore the generational ways in which Black people and brown people have a kind of stuckness, because we have made this accommodation where there is this, it's not just a wall, it's like cement, right? It's like there's no bridge. And so with your work and with other work, it is to face that history in such a way that we can answer my 6-year-old's question. She's learning about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And she said, did you know one of the fundamental needs? And I said, well, Ava, what does fundamental mean? She said, well, we're going to have fun at the mentals. 6-year-old. That basically just food, shelter, just belonging. I mean, until you get to the high part, her naming that. 6-year-old. And so Price, me, and others are saying to all of us, believe Black people when they say you this is hurting. I might have arrived, but my daughter, because of all the ways in which I had to do these extra, didn't have the kind of time with me, because I was busy getting this education and this education. I'm not just saying that about Black people, but when you add race and when you add gender to these things, right? And so I think that Price offers a valid critique to hold that intention.
Well, I noticed at some point, I've been really interested in school reform.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get into the weeds about why or how that happened, but I was so struck by the fact that we now people can go in and take kids in the toughest circumstances with everything going against them and bring them to full, fluent literacy by the end of the 3rd grade and change the entire arc of that kid's life.
Right.
And what I noticed was that my conservative white friends would all say to me, well, you can't do anything for those kids until you repair the family. My liberal white friends would say, you can't do anything for those kids until you end poverty and racism. And so we're all agreed, can't do anything. So we're off the hook, might as well go home now.
Yeah.
And it's a lie. It's not true. We can do things. We have things right in front of us that we can do that can change these kids' lives. And so it seems so important. What I hear when I hear us white people saying we can't do anything, I hear that wall.
Yeah.
I just hear othering.
Yeah. Yeah.
They can't be us.
Yeah.
And we can't be them because we are different critters.
Yeah.
And what the school reform thing says to me is, no, we're not different at all. And babies are miracles. And babies have huge brains. You can't stop them from learning all day long. And all we have to do is get into them and teach them how to read. Is that so bad?
I learned a new word called ecotones. Ecotones. And I'm trying to find, is there this, again, I'm going to this place in the middle that's neither where the conservative friends you described or the liberal friends, but something that doesn't exist on both sides. The school reform is part of what exists in the middle. My concern is, what is their nutrition? What is their health care? Because it's so systematic, so we get them to read, but they're not immunized. We don't get them immunized and they're eating food that's not good for them. it adds up. So what's that space in the middle to take that school reform? And thank God, yes, they can have food, and we're trying to make sure their food is right, but getting them to the right health care. And then when they're getting home, what I do hear, like there needs to be some safety at home because of what they were exposed to. There was, in the pandemic, a friend of mine said that when the pandemic happened, his kids began to text him. He does an after-school program. His kids began to text him. He was like, they said, in South Dallas, an apartment complex, this pandemic is going to kill us. And he was like, well, wear your mask and make sure you sanitize. He was like, no, the safest time we ever feel.
Right.
So the education system works. The reform works until we get another pandemic or until we get another time of isolation, and the kids are isolated 8 hours a day. So I want to take that school reform, but I'm like, how do we equip our social workers? How do we create these systems that help to undergird and support what's happening with that school reform?
And as you're talking, I'm thinking of Kelvin Walker's point. What if I was looking at kids who didn't have enough to eat? If they go outside, they might get shot. Somebody's going to try to sell them drugs. What if I was looking at those kids and they were my kids
Right.
instead of their kids?
Yep.
What if I thought of them as my kids?
Yeah.
Man, I think I'd be up and at it a little bit. That'd be a call to action.
There's this word I want to share. I don't know if you've heard Ubuntu. And it's a wonderful word that comes from the continent of Africa in the language. They say this, and I want to invite you to say it with me. I am because you are.
Because you are.
And you are.
And you are.
Because I am.
And I am.
I am because you are.
Because you are.
And you are because I am. For me to say that in a white church and to keep saying it as part of our benediction, which means good word, it's for my church to look at this sun-kissed skin Sunday after Sunday, and for them to finally probably really hear, I'm not 3/5 human. Because systems, right, have been baked in, and there's something wrong with her, the way she talks, the way she moves, the way she, there's something fundamentally flawed with me.
Right.
But it's not, because I am, because you are. And that's how we get to this hour that you're talking about. I think it's wonderful to think about if the children become our common peace, and we're gonna fight on how we're gonna get them the pace. But let's begin to, if we can do it for the children, because we all were once children.
Speaking of children, there's a question about children for both of you. How does the language of he, she, they fit with our kids, their kids? Do you see that as unifying or creating more division? That's for both of you.
So are they talking about the pronoun usage, or? I'm going to be honest. These millennials and exennials are stretching me. Everybody just stretch. They're stretching me, just like every generation stretches. And there's something to it to think about ourselves in this third person, and not the singular gendering binary ways. It's fascinating and it's hard. And my associate pastor, Ken Crawford, always says, we're humans, we do hard stuff. If I was in the church, I'd probably say it a different way. It'd be a different S word. We do hard stuff. And so, yeah, as I hear that, it forces me to work through another generation's understanding the imago Dei, like who are we as the created, and how these pronouns has boxed us in, and gendering has boxed us in, and how they're now stretching us to think about one another in a more communal sense, which is the way God talks about God's self in the beginning. In the beginning, when God created, and we hear this this we language. And we think about it as in terms of Trinitarian, but it's a communal sensibility about who God is. And so, yeah, this gendering, I mean, I realize how old I am by how much I'm resisting putting that on my Zoom. It was just what they're asking us to do. And so, yeah.
Thank you. How do you hear that?
Well, my wife and I are both have been journalists, writers, and she was an editor for a long time. And she's a great copy editor and a stickler for grammar. So
It's
our
maddening.
son is an entertainer, and he was coming through Dallas. He was living in South Carolina, but he was coming through town in a van with some fellow entertainers and a show that they were doing around the country. And one of the entertainers was a transgendered woman. And so my son came to us first and said he wanted to make sure we understood
Sure.
about the pronouns. And we kept working on it. And my wife was trying to explain to him how this caused a grammatical inaccuracy. And the sentences wouldn't work together.
Right.
And my son is very patient with his parents. So he kept working on it for a long time, and then he heaved this big sigh and he said, "Can you just be nice?" And we said, "Yeah, we can do that."
Yeah.
And the irony was that the transgendered woman in the group, we thought they were all going to be crazy artists, which they were, avant-garde people. But she was this very southern person from South Carolina who winds up in the kitchen with my wife looking at all my wife's mother's China painting stuff. And they're talking about China painting. Oh my gosh. And now my wife and that woman they correspond all the time. They're best buddies. I'm not sure exactly what the pronoun deal is. I try not to listen. But I can't, what I do, and I recommend this, is to try to sort of look the other way, and walk off and talk so they have to figure out who you're talking to.
I have a young adult whose name is Nathaniel, and Nathaniel is she. And so you have what I understand is a traditional male name and a female pronoun, and I mess up all the time. But she sees me like I talk slower, I'm focused. It's the imago Dei for me. It's that image of God, and I so want to honor her, white woman, born male, because I want her to honor me. And in our common struggle, something beautiful has happened. Because when I hear someone else say, Nathaniel, and he said, I was like, she. And so when we become advocates for the other and stop othering one another, something more beautiful can happen. So
Thank you for that.
it's a wrestle. It's a wrestle.
Jim, this is for you, but I want to call you back to, Reverend Law talked about needing therapy. One of the questions comes, it says, some of us can't believe that this book was banned. How did you feel? What did that do inside when that happened? And how did you deal with that?
Because of the passages you were reading, the slavery passages, which were shocking to me to come across on the microfilm machine, I was prepared for some kind of blowback. I wasn't prepared for it to. The editor of the book kept calling me up and moving up my deadline, saying, "You got to hurry up," and he wouldn't tell me why. And then he finally said, "We made it. The book is on the presses, and they're going to push the button Monday and print it." And then he called me that Monday morning, shaky voice, maybe crying, I don't know. And he said, they're out in the back shop now pulling it off the presses. It's been killed. And I just felt enormous anger and frustration. And I also thought, this is really dangerous. There's so much that was right about Dallas, and still is right, and still working and happening. And I was from Detroit, and I was in Detroit for the '67 riot. I knew exactly what happens if you just try to bottle this all up. And it's a tremendously powerful and evil thing, and you have to get it out and hope you can get it out and manage it in a way that doesn't burn everything down.
Right.
So I found the suppressing of the book to be scary. This publisher in New Jersey printed 5,000 copies and sent them here, and half of them disappeared in a mysterious warehouse fire. And in the presence of my in-laws, I married a Dallas native. I made the mistake of wondering if I should get a shotgun. And I could see my father-in-law going, he doesn't have a shotgun. He really is a Yankee hippie. And now he's exposing my daughter to this risk. I thought it was scary and it was something that couldn't endure. I didn't know what was going to happen. Of course, the book was republished recently, and that was a fascinating experience, the why and the wherefore for that. It was not my idea, but the suppression of it was a shock to me.
So you talked about the progress. Was there a person or an event that you can point to that was sort of either the seminal person or event or reason for the progress in this city that you can point to?
Only very grudgingly, very, very grudgingly, but undeniably. And it's because he was brought here and put in place by these Citizens Council guys, the ones who suppressed my book. But I have to acknowledge that there was the business leadership and then business leadership. There was the old style, ultra-racist, Colonel Sanders type guys who were going to never move an inch. And then there were a lot of other business leaders, corporate people, not all corporate, locally owned businesses who were doing business all over the country and all over the world. And they were coming back here and recognizing that Dallas had a problem. That Dallas said this wasn't a good place to do business. This wasn't a good place to try to bring investors back. One of them was a man named Bill Solomon, who second generation CEO of Austin Industries. And he was instrumental in bringing Ron Kirk here to be the city's first black mayor. Mm-hmm. And Ron Kirk, when he became mayor, had this, the main thing about Ron Kirk as mayor, I didn't agree with him on any local issues, but Ron Kirk, to watch, was amazingly effective. He was very competent. Mm-hmm. He got things going. He didn't put up with foolishness at the city council level. And all of a sudden, I heard older white people in the city saying, well, you know, that Ron Kirk seems to be quite competent. Like, I'm going to pass out because there's this black man who's doing a great job of running the city. And I think the challenge was never South. Black people knew exactly what was happening and what had to be done. The challenge was North and white, and it was enormously effective for Ron Kirk to be here and to be the mayor in front of everybody where they could see him. And I think I can't put my finger on it, but I have this gut sense that sort of lifted the city up and moved it forward about 20 years.
Thank you. I believe we have about 10 minutes, and we're going to get through all of these questions.
Okay.
So,
All right.
this is for both of you. We've talked about reckoning. Several of the questions deal with this reckoning with history. And in some circles, there's a willingness to engage with history. In some circles, there's a real resistance to it. What history might the church reckon with, and what is the church's role? Where do you see the church's role moving forward, and how to address it?
There's this way, I don't know why Africa is so much in my mind. I was with a group of Black preachers, so maybe that's it. But we had this morning in Waco at Baylor, this Sankofa experience where it's a bird that whose feet is going forward, but who looks backwards. And so one of the ways I want to look backward is a quote from the book. I tell you, I've been reading that. Standing more or less alone between the settled East and Wild West, and never enjoying the full trust of either side. Dallas developed a self-conscious fascination with its own character and origin, as if it determined to explain itself. The no reason for being myth has almost no kinship with truth. Dallas was founded for precisely the same reason that inspired most of the settlements in the American interior during the westward expansion, because it was at the intersection of major trails and trade routes. And because the people who named and platted it hoped they would be able to promote it, pull in some traffic, and sell their lots at a profit. That intersection and myth fascinated me.
Really?
And there's the myth, and then there's the story, and the Accommodation tells real stories. And so my way forward as a church, my thought forward, if we are indeed at this intersection where the East meets the West, if this intersection as you describe it is true, how can the church be somewhat of an intersection? I think the church is a great place for that to happen. At that intersection, this horizontal and vertical and all the spaces in between, at that intersection, how might the church in Dallas, how might we see this intersection and come together for real around this issue of race, around how we might move forward but not afraid to look backwards? Because history repeats itself. And while we don't believe we would call another group to enslave them, while we don't believe that these systems will become as harsh and as dehumanizing, that look at history as the church in the intersection helps us to say never again. And our way forward calls us to have these conversations. And this conversation leads us to another conversation where there's more healing and hope. And that means you got to give up a little something for that to happen. You might have to give up a little square footage. You might have to give up some of the scholarships. You might have to give up so that we can make room. That's what Jesus did.
Making room often makes us uncomfortable. So I think this is a perfect segue to this question. For you, Jim, obviously one could say that writing this book made room. Did you experience any kind of threats in the production of it, and the research and the writing of it? Did you experience anything because of that?
No, I didn't experience physical threats. Just there was this growing cloud of resistance. I knew that something was going on out there in resistance to the book, but I didn't, the publisher, the editor wouldn't tell me who it was or what it was. And I, even after the book came out, the effect, it was so ironic that they suppressed it, or pulled it off the presses. They did not need to do that. Nobody white was going to read it anyway. And even when it showed up, I found it in one white bookstore at North Park. And it was in the travel and leisure section. And I asked the manager, why do you have it there? And he picked it up and he said, well, it's about accommodations.
It's priceless.
When I told him what it was about, he said, well, in my presence, he pulled it off the shelves and threw them in boxes. He said, I'm sending those back to the publisher. And that was it. It just died. And so, no, I don't have a heroic role for myself as out there facing down the Klan or anything. I just went back to work, and the book was just, it was ignored by white Dallas, and it was read quite closely by black intelligentsia, clergy, business, everybody south. But it was like everything else in Dallas, that there was that division.
For you first, Jim, and then you, Reverend Law, what thought would you leave this group with tonight after our conversation?
Well, you asked what is the role of the church. I was thinking, I was a kid in the 50s. My dad was a minister. He belonged to the Lions Club, the Optimist Club, and we'd get dragged to these luncheons. And my mother was a teacher. She belonged to all kinds of stuff she went to. That's all gone. It's not there anymore. And I look here, I think you're it in terms of public gathering together. Where else are people still physically being in each other's midst? So, I mean, the role of the church, it seems to me, is preserving that candle, because I don't see it anywhere else.
What was the question?
What thought, considering everything tonight, would you leave? What final thought would you leave with the group tonight?
My grandmother, born in the 1920s, died 3 years ago at the age of 98. She, when going to vote, they moved her voting poll place. She was the help, a domestic worker, and her great nieces, her nieces in the audience looking at you, looking at Grandma. Moved her to a different place. She walked there. She took a bus there. You have to vote by a certain time. This is before early voting. There's no transportation. My grandma, Texan, real Texan, did not have a driver's license all the way up to 98. She drove us crazy, but she never had a driver's license. Had a fishing license and she had a gun license. She's a real Texan. She did shoot a man, but Lord rest her soul. I'm not even Catholic, but... And knowing that helps me be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because just to vote and to be denied and having to bring her poll tax receipt to get the right to vote, only to have to go to another place and then to say that that place was closed, and just the games that, like, knowing how uncomfortable it was just to vote. So it came to early voting, and I tell my mom and dad, I was like, I'm voting early, I'm getting my vote in, and they like to go the day of voting and stand in the line. My parents are in their 80s. So they didn't have the right to vote until they were in their mid-20s. I would leave each of us in the imago Dei of that 98-year-old black woman who would be 103 now, or 101, and that 86 and 83-year-old black man and that 3-year-old black boy and that 6-year-old black girl. And knowing in between them I exist. And right now I'm living in a house with 2 white people in their 60s, full time. I'm leading a church that's predominantly white. Those are the images I want us to hold and to get comfortable with being uncomfortable with knowing that woman who was denied to vote even though she had the right to vote. To know the work that my parents had to do so that I can do this work. And to promise to build better systems in the church and beyond, so that 3-year-old and 6-year-old won't have to do what that 98-year-old did. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for being here this evening. The conversation doesn't end or stop here. If it does, what is the point? I hope that you all drive home safely. It has been an absolute pleasure, Your Honor, and most beautiful Queen. You all drive safe and have a great night. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I can't believe you.